Hello, I'm David Gura at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York. President Trump expected to hold a news conference very shortly in Vietnam after his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ended. With apparently no agreement and a sudden change to the schedule, it appears to have eliminated a signing ceremony in which both leaders were expected to speak. Separate motorcades carrying the president and the North Korean leader left the meeting site just a short time ago. They're heading back to their respective hotels. President Trump and Chairman Kim appeared earlier today and sounded hopeful about the negotiations. This summit marks the first time both leaders have met since last June's talks in Singapore. That meeting resulted in an agreement that included a promise from North Korea to work toward complete denuclearization, but it was short on specific steps. Let's go now to NBC White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, who's with us from Hanoi. And Kelly, we were waiting for this lunch to begin. We expected to hear from these two leaders at the start of that lunch. The minutes kept ticking by, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40 minutes, and then we heard from the press secretary. What is she telling you? What is the White House telling you about what happened here and indeed what's going to happen next?
Well, this is a real siren because Sarah Sanders is saying there is no deal, no agreement reached by the two leaders. That is not the way this roadmap was supposed to go. That is a major development and a major failure of the coming together of this relationship that the president has touted so extensively with himself and Chairman Kim Jong-un. They skipped the lunch. They skipped what would have been a signing ceremony, which would have been some kind of an agreement that they would each commit to next steps. At this point, Sarah Sanders is saying it was a productive conversation, a productive meeting, but no deal. That is a major headline for the president to travel more than 8,000 miles from Washington to have a country like Vietnam host this summit and to have nothing come out of it. Good conversations and relationship building are one thing, but there were expectations that there would be something deliverable to come out of this summit. That has not happened. It did occur in sort of a cascade of events where we saw the schedule changing. We saw the no formal lunch, which would have included cameras going in to sort of get a sense of the room and to get some of the images that we've seen, then a signing statement where they would be able to declare, at least on some level, what they agreed upon. And we did not have high expectations that it would be what the Singapore summit set out to achieve, verifiable denuclearization on the part of North Korea. The expectations were something far less than that, but even that was not met. And so now the president is expected to come here and to do a concluding press conference with not only the White House press corps that has traveled, but international media as well. And we will look to him to explain what went wrong. David?
Thank you very much, Kelly. Stay with us, if you would. We're going to go now to Bill Neely, our chief global correspondent, who is also in Hanoi. And Bill, I know you were lending an ear to what we heard from these two leaders over the course of the morning. President Trump talking about economic opportunity, as he did last night as well. At that first dinner that he had with the North Korean leader, were there signs as the day progressed that things were going awry?
Well, there was no sign. In fact, quite the opposite. There was a sign that the two were very relaxed together. The three watchwords, I thought, from President Trump were patience, praise and promise. He was lavishing praise on Kim Jong-un. By the way, I'm just hearing a motorcade behind me, and just a few minutes ago we filmed Kim Jong-un's motorcade leaving the Metropole Hotel, which is just 100 yards over my right-hand shoulder here. President Trump was also stressing patience. He said, I'm in no rush. Speed is not that important to me. We don't want the testing, and we've developed something very special with respect to that. I hear everything that Kelly O'Donnell has said. It is possible, though, first of all, that President Trump will spin this at the news conference that's to begin at the top of the hour and say this isn't necessarily the end, and that may well be true. This may be a bump in the road rather than the end of the process. Interestingly, that Kim Jong-un, in an extraordinary development, was asked two questions by American reporters, and he too stressed patience. He said, he was asked, are you ready to denuclearize? And he said, if I'm not willing to do that, I wouldn't be here right now. And he was also asked, are you confident? And he said it was too early to tell, but I'm not pessimistic I have a feeling good results will come out. Now, the question is, when will those good results come out, and what was the sticking point? Was it the issue of sanctions relief? Was it the issue of, for example, the immediate closure of the main North Korean processing plant at Yongbyon? We simply don't know, but hopefully at the top of the hour, President Trump will enlighten us further. So, yes, it's a setback. It's a symbolic setback. It's a very public one, but it does not mean the end of these nuclear negotiations. David?
My colleague Bill Neely in Hanoi. Bill, stay with us as well, if you would. I want to bring in now Ambassador Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and U.S.'s lead negotiator for the Iran nuclear deal. She's also an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. Ambassador Sherman, what do you take what we just heard there from Bill Neely and from Kelly O'Donnell as well? Kelly describing this as a siren. I look at the statement from the press secretary here regarding that summit. She, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, characterizing this as a series of very good and constructive meetings in Hanoi. NBC News reporting earlier today there was a scale back of what the U.S. wanted. Not complete, verifiable denuclearization, willing to accept something beyond that. And part of this was a sense that maybe the U.S. could make do with a series of regular meetings. Is there any way possible that President Trump, when he steps up to that lectern at the Marriott in Hanoi, is going to be able to spin this in a positive way?
Well, he's going to try very hard. Yes. I've written statements like Sarah Sanders just put out, where you say we've had constructive conversations, they've been productive, no one's in a rush, we're going to do this right. The president laid that predicate earlier today, but there's no question that this is a setback, that the bromance has hit a bad time, bump in the road, as there are in many relationships. But this one matters because we're talking about nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver those weapons. So this is tough, but I'm sure the president will say, I don't think he's going to tell us what the glitch was. And the glitch may have been the two things that Bill Neely said, which is that we weren't willing to give Kim the sanctions relief he wanted to dismantle part of Yongbyon, which is where most of the fissile material is made for nuclear weapons. So Bill may be exactly right on that point, but the bottom line here is the President of the United States has had a very bad 48 hours between what's happened here domestically with Michael Cohen, what's happening in Hanoi, and quite frankly, David, the very dangerous situation between India and Pakistan, what's happening in Venezuela. Things feel a little out of control.
I want to ask you about a piece that your former colleague, Ambassador Susan Rice, wrote for the New York Times. She talked about how perhaps the best way forward here would be to use the model that you worked so hard to craft, that Iran nuclear deal. And in that piece in the New York Times, she also talked about the need for this to be a multilateral conversation. Are we seeing here the failure of Trump's bilateralism? He has been such a proponent of the relationship, the one-on-one relationship between leader and leader. In the case of Iran, it was a multi-party negotiation over many years' time.
It was a multi-party negotiation, but it was also a really well-prepared negotiation. To ask Steve Biegun, who's the special envoy, to prepare this summit in basically 3 weeks' time, from the time it was announced to the time it happened, maybe it was a little bit more than that, but not much, is absurd because he has to consult South Korea. He has to consult Japan. He has to consult China and Russia and many other people around the world. And he has to work with his counterpart. He had actually 2 meetings with his counterpart. You can't put the details of something this complex together, even if you're going to make an incremental step in such a short period of time.
Where is President Moon Jae-in, the leader of South Korea, as all of this is unfolding? What is he thinking when you look at what's catalyzed these conversations? You read a lot of the reporting. It says President Trump wanted this second summit to happen. But the South Korean president is somebody who has pushed very hard here for maybe not a restoration of normalcy between these two countries, North and South Korea, but a movement in that direction.
Indeed. We've seen that, unfortunately, the Korean stock market is down this morning. Really a precipitous fall. Hopefully it'll find its way back up a little bit. But I think that Moon Jae-in wants that exchange. He hoped for some waivers from the UN sanctions and our bilateral sanctions so that they could get the railroad construction going between the two countries. They could get the Kaesong industrial plant going again. They could have some small projects that say actually what the president's been saying. There's a great economic future for you here. They wanted to get that started. Moon Jae-in would not call this the sunshine policy, what he's doing, which was what Kim Dae-jung did during the Clinton years. But it is a little bit of that. It's let's start having a relationship and maybe we can get to the right place.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.